Welcome, subscribers and newcomers. I'm your host, Tony Baker, and this month I have a wide variety of music and information to pass on as we remember Janos Starker and his music-making legacy. April 28, 2019 marks the 6th anniversary of Janos Starker's death, so I've tried to put together something a little bit different than my past YouTubes for this remembrance. I opened with Mr. Starker playing Gabriel Fauré's Papillon, Opus 77. Mr. Starker's partner on the recording is pianist Leon Palmers, and it was made on Period Records circa 1955. On March 29, 2005, Mr. Starker played at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. 2 days later, the New York Times carried a review of the concert, which was part of Jamie Laredo's Chamber Music at the Y series. On the program was Boccherini's Quintet in C, Kodai's Serenade Opus 12, and the Brahms Sextet No. 1. Fortunately for us, Mr. Starker's daughter, Gabriella, had an audio recording of this concert and was kind enough to give it to me to share with you. Let's have a listen to the second movement of the Boccherini. Mr. Starker is playing the first cello part. Joining Mr. Starker in this live performance is Jamie Laredo, his wife Sharon Robinson, and Ida Kavafian and her husband Stephen Tenenbaum. For your information, Ivan Chan played in the Kodai and Brahms selections. Next up, we have a special guest, former Starker student Robert Batty. Robert grew up in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and is an active performer as well as an attorney. He has served on the faculties of the State University of New York, the University of Missouri, and in Washington, D.C. at the Levine School. He is currently director of the Gettysburg Chamber Music Workshop. His extensive writings on music have appeared in the Washington Post, Strings Magazine, and the Washington Classical Review. Let's hear what Robert has to say about Mr. Starker. Welcome, Robert, and thank you for agreeing to this interview. It's been about 6 years since Mr. Starker died. Many of us may be reminiscing about him. When did you first become aware of Mr. Starker, and did that have anything to do with you deciding to become a cellist?
No, I came to knowledge of Starker fairly late as a student. I was a late starter as a cellist in the first place, but my first couple of teachers were devoted to other cellists, and I didn't have wasn't internet back then. I didn't have any other avenues of learning about cellists. My first teacher, Dorothy Jarvin, a Juilliard-trained cellist, she never mentioned him. And then summers I studied with David Finkel, of course, was a Rostropovich devotee. I don't remember him ever talking about Starker. So to me, the sort of the cello world at that point revolved around Rostropovich. And then I went to Interlochen Arts Academy for 9th and 10th grades. I was a percussion major at that time. I noodled around on the cello. My percussion teacher, knowing that I played cello, invited me over one evening and said, "I want to play you something." And he put on Starker's EMI Kodai Sonata, and the earth moved. And so thereafter, so I was in Interlochen for those 2 years. And then Starker came during that. I think my second year, he visited the campus.
I see. And was that the first time that you saw him and got to meet him? And what were your first impressions of him?
Yes, he came because the conductor of the orchestra there, Nicholas Harshani, was a violist, had been a violist, and had played in a quartet with Starker. They were fellow Hungarians. So it was a big coup for the campus to get him. This is in the late 1960s, when his career was at its peak. The demand for him was at its peak. So it was a great deal that we could get him. He came and played 2 concertos with the orchestra and also gave a master class. Of course, I attended the master class, and at one point I remember going up to him like a snotty little kid, having read on the jacket liner notes of the Kodai Sonata that the instrument he was playing at that time, the Lord Aylesford Strad, was supposed to be known as the largest cello in the world. At that time at Interlochen, he was no longer playing that instrument. Of course, I didn't know that, but I went up to him. It was sort of our only exchange. I was certainly not good enough to play in the class. I just attended it. But when he was like packing the cello up afterwards, I went up to him. I looked at the cello. I said, "That doesn't look so big."
So, with that, at some point, you must have made a decision to study with Mr. Starker, and what made you decide to do that? And was there any special process you had to go through to become one of his students?
Well, I'd say to make a decision to study with him, like at that point, it would be like saying I was making a decision that I would become a world famous cellist. There's decisions and then there's goals. So I had a goal certainly of studying with him, but I knew that an artist of his caliber wasn't going to take cellists at my level. I mean, at the point we're talking about being a junior in high school. So I went to other institutions and had some fine teachers, but I always thought if I got the chance to study with him, I would certainly take the chance. And the chance came when I'd actually had graduated with both a bachelor's and master's degree in cello performance. So I was working in an orchestra in Florida, string quartet and orchestra job in Florida. And he came through on tour to give a recital. of course, I knew about this in advance, and I wrote to him and I said, when you're here in Sarasota, could I play for you? With the idea of enrolling at Indiana as a doctoral student. And so that's what happened. He wrote back and said, yes, I could contact, find him when he's there. And I did play for him, and that's how. So I did that before any formal application process at Indiana. I did audition at Indiana as a freshman and was accepted as a freshman, but I knew there were four full-time cello teachers at the time. I knew I certainly wouldn't have qualified for his class as a freshman, and so I didn't attend. I went somewhere else. So I mean, I'd been to the school and applied there, but it wasn't until I was essentially a young professional that I went to him sort of as for finishing school.
Okay. Well, sort of talking about Mr. Starker as a teacher, at times he's often been referred to as being very strict or severe as a teacher, yet his students usually speak warmly of him. How do you explain this seeming dichotomy?
Well, first of all, not all of his students spoke warmly of him, because he was strict, he was severe, and
what exactly does that mean in terms of him as a teacher being strict or severe? You have to be quiet, or what?
Well, the first thing is that he was a very busy man. He was on tour most of the time, and when he would come back from 3-4 weeks away, and sort of cram in lessons until he left again. He did his best. I believe he said once that he had, at least on paper, that he gave 10 lessons to each of his students per semester. Of course, a semester is longer than 10 weeks, but tough. But those 10 lessons were, you might have 2 one week, and then nothing for a month, and then another week when you had 3 lessons. And so, he understood that this was an onerous and difficult situation for a student at any level if you're still a student. And so he felt that those 10 hours spaced very strangely and intermittently throughout the semester, that you really needed to have your game on. You had to be fully prepared. You had to listen to every word, and there was no goofing around. He said, your job right now during this 1-hour lesson is to collect information, and then you might have weeks when all you have is that hour of information, and when he saw you again, he expected that you had processed, integrated, adopted what he said. Of course, I mean, he had to, every time he was in residence in Indiana, he would, if he was there in Bloomington on a Saturday, there would be a Saturday class where everyone attended and 4 different students played. And he also encouraged us to play for other teachers in the school, and not just cello teachers. But Gary Hoffman, who was a classmate of mine, was essentially already a teacher, and I think he joined the faculty either my second year or third year. I mean, he was on a different level than the rest of us, and Gary was, though, still on paper a student there. So he sort of functioned as Starker's assistant. So it wasn't like you had only your 10 hours with him, but he expected on time, prepared, listening carefully, and using your brain for everything he said. He didn't joke around. He didn't care in the slightest if he was your friend. He wanted you to take those 10 hours and treat them with the value that they in fact were.
So those students that, can I assume that you're one that does speak warmly of Mr. Starker?
Oh, indeed.
And but you were still under these strict and severe conditions. So why is it that someone like you and other students, are very fond of Mr. Starker and think of him that way, and others are they not successful, or they're jealous, or why do they not think so warmly of him?
Well, his view of the lesson, again, I'm sort of coming back to this idea about the 10 hours that you had with him. And, it sometimes worked out that if you, on your end, like you didn't have the 3 hours. I knew people who, for whatever logistical reasons, didn't even get their 10 lessons. However, what he preached was that with such short amount of time with a teacher in a whole semester, just 10 personal private hours, that his job was to deliver to you the absolute truth, the unvarnished, unfiltered, absolute truth about your playing, number one, and number two, what you should do about it, how you can improve it. I've never had any other teacher like that. In other words, when I say this was important, what that meant was that to him it was a waste of time to be telling you, oh, that sounds really nice, keep it up. The only thing he talked about was what was wrong and what to do about it. Some of the less mature students had trouble handling this. I had trouble handling it, but he had a couple of undergraduate students that maybe didn't do so well. And one year that one of the teachers was ill, he tried to fit in some of her students into his, and she taught a lot of undergraduates. I sat in on those lessons, and it was really pretty brutal. Some of the female students just left the room in tears. So his idea was that the time with him was for him to tell you what was wrong and what to do about it. And time with compliments and patting you on the head was wasted time, because instead of that making you feel good about yourself, he could tell you a few more things that you were doing wrong. But through this all, we knew that we were studying with one of the great musicians of the 20th century. And we were incredibly fortunate. And, even if you felt he had been unnecessarily rough in a lesson or in a class, every single one of us knew that, we would never forget this time. Incredibly valuable.
Yeah. Could you explain why Mr. Starker performed with no theatrics? And do you think this lack of theatrics caused some critics to describe his performances as cold?
Well, that's absolutely right. His sort of patrician, aristocratic performing style was not to everyone's taste. Audiences and critics had before them many examples of performers who, shall we say, wore their heart on their sleeve, not just cellists, but whose every feeling about every passing mood of the music should be reflected in their face and in their body language. Starker viewed music as an oral art, one that was absorbed through the ears, and he put all of his focus and energy into producing what was to him the most beautiful sounds, the most sort of truthful rendering of the music. And to do that, he had to concentrate really, really, really hard. And he had no time for some of the clowning that one saw then and one sees more and more today.
What is your fondest personal memory of Mr. Starker, either as a student or otherwise?
Well, I've written this anecdote on the Facebook page I put in for Starker, but it involved when I was playing for him in a master class. His master classes were really, really frightening, as you were not just playing for him, but in front of everybody else. And I was the fourth one to play that day, the last student, and he didn't like people waiting outside being prima donnas and practicing right up till it was their turn. He wanted everyone in the room at all times. So it had been 2 hours, almost 2 hours, since I had touched a cello, and I had to play the Schumann concerto. And rarely have I felt my bow shake so much as I did on that occasion. And he had really been pretty hard on the three cellists that preceded me. I think that he realized that he saw my nervousness. Maybe he felt he had sort of done enough damage to other people's egos that day. But he was brusque, but he was relatively businesslike. There were no kind of things that verged on insults as some of the other students had gotten. And it was hard. It was going back and forth, and I couldn't always do as he asked, but it was a sort of a standard. I was doing okay, and then but I was still very, very nervous. Then towards the end, he said he had one more idea he wanted to talk about in the class. He said, "Please start on the third page." I don't memorize music visually. The music is just music in my head. I hadn't looked at the music in quite some time, and I didn't know what he was talking about. He said the third page, and I sort of looked around like an idiot, and he sang the phrase in question, the tone like "you're an idiot." He goes da 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 da, like duh. And so I said, oh, so you mean the development section, which was such a wise-ass, immature thing to sort of to come back at the teacher. And everyone laughed like, oh, isn't Robert such a smartass? And he could have really come down on me, for the sort of the arrogance of what I said. So he just took a puff of the cigarette and he said, "That's the difference between you and me, Bob. You're a musician and I'm only a cellist." And that was a very sweet recovery of him sort of kind of turning it around, but in a kind way. And people laughed even harder, of course, at what he said. But in a way, he sort of saved me. I mean, I was so nervous anyway, and then I'd said that really insolent thing, and he turned it around, and the session ended pretty well.
Yeah, that's a neat story. Can you tell us what Mr. Starker meant when he said we should continue carrying the flag?
Well, again, he had his ideas and principles about music making and cello playing were extremely precise, clear, and uncompromising. And he wanted every one of his students to, carry the flag meant carry the flag of these principles that you're getting from me. Make sure you spread them as far and wide as you can. It's just a turn of phrase of his.
So in terms of these uncompromising principles and tenets, what do you consider, or what do you think Mr. Starker thought were the most important tenets of his teaching?
This would really, I wouldn't say there's anything that was most important. I mean, the things that he taught me would fill several books and many, many hours of discussion. I mean, kind of everything was important to him. But musical integrity to him meant, starting with fidelity to the composer and not just sort of finding a good addition, but musical rhetoric in a way that was true to the composer and his style. A work by Beethoven. I mean, Beethoven wrote this piece of music. After that, we had Brahms and Liszt and Mahler and Schubert, and then we had Broadway and Gilbert and Sullivan and pop songs and jazz and rap, and all that music and the way of the styles of playing that music have been in our ears. And there's some great artists who performed in these styles, but his idea of that, the kind of phrasing that would be appropriate for Stéphane Grappelli or Frank Sinatra was not appropriate for Beethoven. And there's so many details that go into how one interprets music and how one renders music, but he was generally against all artificiality, posturing, unnecessary sort of striving for effect rather than saying the whole piece, seeing how a phrase fit within the whole piece. The subject is too broad to cover even in many bullet points.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help us remember Janos Starker and his music making.
My pleasure.
40 years ago this month, Mr. Starker gave a concert at the Performing Arts Center Concert Hall of Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. For this concert, Mr. Starker played Bach Suite No. 3, Kodai's Solo Cello Sonata, and, as an encore, the Sarabande of Bach Suite No. 2. Thanks again to Gabriella, we can take a look at an excerpt from that performance and watch Mr. Starker's interpretation of Bach Suite No. 3. Before I close, let me again thank Robert Batty and Gabriella Starker. Without their generosity, much of this video would not have been possible. I'll end with an excerpt from the last movement of Maurice Ravel's Trio in A minor, as played by Mr. Starker, with Joseph Suk on violin and Rudolf Buchbinder on piano. The concert was performed on November 22, 1973, and was broadcast on Radio France.